Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. So today I have for you guys a special one. I'm going to be giving you one tip for every single civilization in Age of Empires 2. So we have 37 right now, so you're going to have 37 tips to listen to. And I like this video concept because it's going to be a little bit of information for pretty much everyone in the game, regardless of which civ you're maining or which civs you like to play. These tips will be either obvious that I'm just kind of reinforcing the knowledge you already knew. Maybe I can open your eyes to a different perspective, or maybe I can even show you something that you just hadn't even thought of altogether. So strap in and let's go ahead and hop right into it. So our first civilization here is the Aztecs, and if there's one tip I have for the Aztecs is to make use of their relic bonus by picking up relics in the mid game. Since Aztecs are Mediciv that lack Hussar, your late game is very gold dependent to make use of the Eagles and Trebs, Monks, whatever else you need to complement yourself. So definitely make sure to pick up relics in the mid game to set up a really solid late game with the civilization. Next up, we've got the Berbers, and if there's one bonus you have to make use of with the Berbers is that their stable units are cheaper in Castle Age and Imperial Age, so don't be afraid to go 3 stable knights in early Castle Age, where normally you wouldn't be able to afford it. With Berbers, you actually be able to afford it and put a lot of pressure on your opponent to catch him off guard. Next up, we've got the Bretons, and if there's one thing to note with the Bretons is to make use of their cavalry in the late game. The only upgrade you're missing for their knight line and their light cav line, besides Hussar and Paladin, is bloodlines. So the Cavalier and their light gap is very, very strong to catch your opponent off guard and even just to complement your Arbalest or your longbow army. That's generally to be expected. Next up, we've got the Bulgarians, and I have a very spicy one with Bulgarians. I recommend you play a heavy cavalry Castle Age, so stick with knights, maybe some conics as well. And when your opponent is transitioning into pikes or halberdiers in Imperial Age, do a quick switch up and go for the two-handed swordsmen that are free for Bulgarians, and you can catch your opponent off guard and absolutely wipe his halberdier and end the game right then and there. Next up, we've got the Burgundians. Now with Burgundians, I recommend you guys go with a very passive feudal age. Don't do a lot of scouts since you're lacking bloodlines, but definitely want to pick up the cavalry in Castle Age and make use of their cavaliers. So don't be afraid to go pretty heavy, similarly to Berbers, with like triple stable cavalier all in Castle Age, and just completely power through your opponent. Some say it's not that simple, but maybe it actually is. Next up, we've got the Burmese. One tip for Burmese is not to be too predictable with your men-at-arms, which is the most popular opening by far. They have a really good economy in the early game, so feel free to go scouts or even archers and just transition later into the game to infantry if you actually need them. All right, next up we've got the Byzantine, and if there's one bonus you have to make use of with the Byzantine to have success consistently is that their camel riders, skirmishers, pikemen, halberdier cost 25% less. This is their best savings throughout the game, so I highly recommend you try to make these units whenever possible. Next up is the Celts. My one tip is to watch Huang and do the exact opposite. No, but in all seriousness, I recommend you make use of their siege and infantry as much as possible throughout the game, whether that is in the early game with the men-at-arm rush or in the late game with SO Halb or Siege Ram Halb. Those are the best units for Celts, and it's pretty straightforward. Next up is the Chinese. So my one tip with the Chinese is to master their early game. It has a very strong civilization or tech tree, and it's a very strong civilization throughout the game. That the only tricky part, especially for newer players or not as experienced players, is mastering that Dark Age and that early game. So definitely make sure to master it against the AI or against your friends before hopping onto the rank ladder and showing the world what you have to offer. Next up, we've got the Cumans, and Cumans is another one that tend to be kind of predictable. So my advice for you guys is not to be too predictable and always go for the second TC boom on open maps like Arabia, and sometimes try to mix it up by even going for a drush or men-at-arms or even sometimes some scouts as well that can catch your opponent off guard and kind of hide that second TC strategy that's so popular and save that for another game. Next up, we've got the Ethiopians, and if there's one tip for Ethiopians is to make use of their siege in the late game. They have really good teched out siege, and generally, Ethiopians are thought of as an archer civilization, which they definitely are, but definitely make use of their siege in the late game. You don't even need torsion engines for their siege to be good. They have a really good tech tree and a lot of options there. Next up is the Franks. My best advice to Franks is not to be too predictable and go straight for cavalry in every single game. They have a very smooth economy, and that could be very beneficial to go men-at-arms in the early game or even crossbow and Castle Age. Crossbow and Castle Age allows you to put pressure and boom behind it, and your opponent won't just be able to blindly go pikeman or halberdier expecting you to go knights into cavalier like is most popular with the civilization. So going crossbows allows you to kind of hide that, force your opponent to adapt, and then bam, later you show up with some cavalier in the Imperial Age and you'll have a lot of success with that strategy. Next up, we've got the Goths, and similar to the Franks, I would recommend you don't rush straight into the infantry, because infantry is kind of weak in the early game, generally speaking. They're not as strong as cavalry or archer units, just fundamentally. So I recommend you stick with other units in the early game with Goths, and then only transition to infantry in like late castle to early imp, where you can really start spamming those strong pikemen, huscarls, or champions. Next up, we've got the Huns, and I recommend with the Huns to play as aggressively as possible, because your economy at home won't be that much protected because you'll be lacking houses. So my advice is to play as aggressively as possible, because they're very mobile civ, and their extra fast stables, or faster working stables, allows you to put the pressure in more cases than not. Next up, we've got the Incas, and I recommend you make use of their wide variety of counter units like the Slinger, the Camu, fully upgraded Halbs, and Eagles to really counter whatever your opponent's doing, and keep yourself flexible throughout the game. Don't limit yourself to any one option. Next up, we've got the Indians, and if there's one thing for the Indians that you have to make note of, is that their light cav in the mid game has an extra pierce armor that's very, very strong at dealing with archer civs. So definitely be sure to make use of their light cav against archer civs, and then their camels, which are tried and tested against cavalry civilization. Next up, we've got the Italians, and if there's one thing about the Italians that I love, is that they get fully upgraded hussars, and they are primarily an archer civilization. So highly recommend you make use of their late game with fully upgraded arbalest and unique tech, with their hussar and bomber cannon to make for a very nasty and easy to get to composition. Make use of it in the late game with the Italians. Next up is the Japanese. You got to make use of the early game eco bonus that saves them a lot of wood, which is probably the most important resource for Dark Age and Feudal Age, maybe second to food. So it allows for a lot of special rushes like the 20 pop men at arm, or just general drusher men at arms into archers kind of gameplay. Next up is the Khmers. There's one thing that I don't see often enough, and I love doing as many other players, both top players and your average intermediate or beginner players even, is making use of their jumping into houses bonus. This makes it so you don't have to wall, and you can just use your houses as defense. So I see a lot of players using it, but I also see a lot of players not using it and forgetting about it in certain situations. My advice is to make use of this bonus as much as possible, because it's very good and can save you from having to full wall your entire base. There's a spider there, sorry, I caught my eye. Next up is the Koreans. If there's one tip I have for you, is to try to make use of their war wagons as much as possible. It's a very powerful unit and just so hard to deal with, so try to get to the war wagons in Castle Age wherever possible. Next up is the Lithuanians. My advice is to try to open scouts with them more often than not, and use your scouts left over from Feudal Age to scout the map and look for relics to try and pick up the relics as fast as possible in the Castle Age. Next up is the Magyars. My biggest advice is to not be too predictable with your scout opening, and maybe mix it up a couple of times by going men at arms, because men at arms get an extra 1 attack with Magyars, and is quite a strong rush if you want to just go for some early pressure. So be sure to catch your opponent off guard once in a while with that strategy. Next up, my one tip for melee is to not be too quick to rush your opponent in the Feudal Age, because your economy is very fragile when you get up to Feudal Age, but you have more villagers, so don't be afraid to play a bit defensive and just come surprise your opponent a bit later with better economy and just straightforward units. Next up is the Malians, and Malians, the one thing about Malians that's unique to them is the fact that they get a fully upgraded tech tree in Castle Age in terms of archers and knights, yet they don't have the best upgrades for those units in the Imperial Age. So my biggest advice is definitely make use of the Castle Age, and don't be afraid to play heavy Castle Ages where you're going both crossbows and knights to really kill your opponent instantly. Next up, we've got the Mayans, and if there's one advice for the Mayans is to don't be afraid to go double golden composition in the Imperial Age. Plumes are very strong and eagles are very strong, and both of those in combination can pretty much destroy any one civ in the game. Combine this with the fact that they have longer lasting gold pals and stone pals, lets you, enables you to do these kind of power plays more so than other civilizations. So double gold comp with Mayans, remember it now, it'll win you a lot of games. Next up is the Mongols, and with Mongols I'd recommend don't just go scout opening, because that's the most popular one every single time. Feel free to use their other options, which is like their men-at-arm rush, to catch your opponent off guard from time to time and put the pressure on them. And of course we all know how strong Magyars are, so a little bonus tip there, make use of Magyars. Next up is the Persians, and if there's one tip for Persians is to not get too sucked into their eco bonus and add a bunch of town centers because you have a really strong boom. Sometimes staying on one town center can be really good, because if you add too many town centers, you'll find yourself producing more vills than other civs, because obviously your TCs work faster, but that also means that it takes more food, so it takes more economy to get more economy later. So don't be afraid to stay on 1 or 2 town centers to afford more military if needed. Next up is the Portuguese. My biggest advice is to make use of gold units as much as possible to take advantage of their discounts. And once again, don't be afraid to play both crossbows and knights in the castle age. All right, we have the Saracens. My best advice for Saracens is to make use of their market. Very straightforward. It's pretty much their 1 eco bonus, so make use of it as much as possible. Next up is the Sicilians. My best advice to Sicilians is honestly don't get too caught up with the infantry like the Donjon Rush and the Sergeant. They're not that strong in the early game, so definitely play with their crossbows or the skirmishers or their knights that have the really good bonus damage reduction. And then just transition to Sergeants and Donjons later on in the game where you have a bigger economy. Next up is the Slavs. Now, Slavs have a really good bonus that makes their farmers work faster. My biggest advice is to use this bonus to actually go for a push rather than a boom. It sounds stupid because when you have a farming bonus, you'd think you'd want 40, 50 farmers to make use of it. But actually, if you think about a general game, most of your farms come in the early game. So at the end of Feudal Age, you have like 18 to 20 farms. Maybe 20 is pushing it, but 18 farms generally speaking. And that's actually a really, really good bonus for Slavs to get that 10% extra. So this bonus is actually getting the strongest value relative to, your opponent at that early castle age stage. So don't be afraid to 1TC with Slavs and make use of their faster farming to push instead of booming. Next up is the Spanish. This civ is very, very tricky to play in 1v1 Arabia, so I highly recommend you make use of Conquistadors wherever possible, because it's really just their 1 good unit in castle age that separates them from other units, other civilizations, rather. Next up is the Tartarus. Tartarus have an amazing late game, so my biggest advice would be to just don't be afraid to get to late game and win the game with heavy cav archer and hussars with the unique tech to give them extra armor. It's pretty much good against most late games. Maybe put aside a couple of tricky composition like eagles and halbs, for example. Next up, we've got the Tutans, and my best advice for Tutans is to try to play in a way that's not going to require too much mobility. Teutons lack mobility, but have very strong army that can fight against other melee units, especially their infantry and cavalry that gets the extra armor, but also their siege that's very good at dealing with archers in one spot. So try to make the game so that you don't need a lot of mobility to win, and you can do that by going for forward siege push in Castle Age, walling up your map, and kind of just staying safe at home with some defense. Next up is the Turks, and my best advice for Turks is to really be flexible with what options you have. They're not a very one-dimensional civ, and they don't need gold to play very effectively. They have fully upgraded hussars with extra pierce armor now, so my biggest advice is just to be flexible in the options that you have. You've got gunpowder in Castle Age with janissaries, you've got cavalry archers, you've got the fast stim potential, and you have free hussars that come in pretty clutch. So keep yourself open to a lot of different options with the civ, and it's actually quite flexible these days. Next up is the Vietnamese, and my best advice with Vietnamese is to send your scout forward in the early game and go to your opponent's town center and try to find some of their sheep in the early game, lame them a bit, and do a good job scouting their map in the early game, and make use of that bonus that allows you to see their town center. It's kind of shitty to for me to be condoning laming, but with this civ, it's actually very consistent and pretty good to do. As awkward as it could be to say it sometimes. Next up is the Vikings. My best advice for Vikings is to make use of their economy as much as possible and look for your timing windows, especially in early imp, to end the game, because your late game, while it's not bad, it's not the best and it can get beat by other civilizations. So make use of that timing in early imp, where you should be stronger than a lot of other civilizations, and you can really end the game with Arblast Spike and their infantry plus some of their siege. All right, well, I think we've covered every single civilization in the game. This is going to be going live on Twitch first before YouTube, and it's going to be part of my marathon stream or subathon, whatever the hell I'm going to call it. So hopefully you guys are enjoying the content while I'm asleep, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. Take care, bye for now, and sub it up.